Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Daphne A. Brooks, the William R. Keenan Jr. Professor of African American Studies, American Studies, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Music at Yale University. She's the author of the classic Bodies in Dissent, Spectacular Performances of Race and Freedom, 1850 to 1910, which was published by Duke University Press in 2006. And she joins us today to talk about Liner Notes for the Revolution, the intellectual life of Black feminist sound, which was published by Harvard University in February of 2021. Of Liner Notes for the Revolution, the great Margot Jefferson writes, Daphne Brooks has written a gloriously polyphonic book. Moving through the tumult of the 20th century and the millennium, she scores, archives, and curates the history of Black women musicians and their radical modernities, all created in a culture that presumed that they had no voice or minds. What did they do to be so Black, brilliant, and blue? Listen and read on. How are you doing today, Professor Brooks?
Mark Anthony Neal, man. It is great to be here with you. Thank you for holding it down in the public sphere all these years.
Thank you.
Helping us to keep up with the flavor in our ears.
So Daphne, this is a big ass book.
I know. Heavy ass, big ass. Yeah, I know.
Talk a little bit about your journey to this book.
Long journey that really, in many ways, I've been writing the book for about a dozen years, but I think we always like to say that we've been writing the book, whatever book it is, all our lives. I mean, sometimes that's not the case. That's true for me with this book. It's a book that really was trying to merge all of these different parts of myself. The Bay Area 1970s post-civil rights soul babies child who was growing up in Jim Crow migrants culture of my parents who had escaped the Jim Crow South, I should say, in 1950. My late father, Nathaniel Hawthorne Brooks, had moved with his new bride, Juanita Catherine Watson Brooks, to Berkeley, California, where my dad was going to grad school at UC Berkeley. And they became educators, and they had 3 kids. And the first kid was born in 51, the second one in 58, and then menopause baby in 1968. Didn't know what hit them. So what does that have to do with my writing of this book? Really everything, because in our stratified generational household, I was growing up with the sounds of Ellington and Basie and Coltrane from my dad, and Billy Eckstine and the Spinners from my mom, and the Temptations and Jimi Hendrix from my brother, and the Jackson 5, as well as, wait for it, because this is the integration moment, my sisters listening to Barry Manilow and going to Saturday Night Fever and coming home with the Bee Gees and all of that. And then I've got my own new Black aesthetic experience to, shout out to Trey Ellis with all sorts of caveats about places where I disagree with Brother Trey, who I got to meet in my time teaching at UC San Diego years ago. But this idea of, being, he called it a cultural mulatto. I never liked that, but, and you've written so brilliantly about post-civil rights, Black aesthetics. And for me, absorbing all of that music and then moving down the AOR music dial or radio dial to, to pick up the Clash and the Police and, the burgeoning new wave radio playlists as well as classic rock. It meant that didn't nobody want to hear that at my house. So then I'm taking the bus to Tower Records on El Camino Real. Big ass emporium of sounds, but also books and magazines. And so I'm reading Rolling Stone magazine, and I'm discovering Grail Marcus's Mystery Train and Chris Gow over, in the Village Voice, which they were selling there. So I'm reading all that stuff. And at the same time, my sister, who's 10 years older than me and now a legendary radio personality for over 30 years in the Bay Area, Rennell Brooks Moon, but she went to Mills College in Oakland and brought home to me, the Black feminist literary renaissance. So it was, Bluest Eye and Corregidora, which I should not have been reading at the age that I was reading it. That did a number on me, but and her acting out for Colored Girls, because she had, been in a little neighborhood production, and all that stuff was living inside of me. And I wanted to be able to think those two things together, Black feminist literary and cultural production, which mattered so much to me and saved my life, and the rock and roll music that I was drawn to in the context of the hip hop generation, putting that all together, the birth of the Black Rock Coalition in the 1980s, right? So this is you got more than you asked for with this question, but it led up to kind of like, why can't we be able to claim the kind of authority and power and imagination of rock music criticism and apply it to some of the most revolutionary music that was ever created, by Black women? And what if we could tell a story as well of the sisters themselves, as well as some ally badass white women like Ellen Willis and Rosetta Wright, who has her own story, but who were invested in trying to tell feminist theoretical stories of sound in and of themselves. Wrights was much more interested in the Black feminist side of that story than Ellen Willis was. But Ellen Willis has her own ties to the Black radical tradition, which I try to bring out in this book as well.
Yeah. There's a way in which this book is obviously a response to the pantheon of white boy rock critics. Right. But you do so much more with it, right? I mean, you are really foregrounding Black women's musical practices as insurgent intellectual practice. Which you mentioned, linked to the matter of Black life. Why was that a choice that resonated so powerfully for you to do that kind of work? I mean, because this really could have simply been a survey.
Right.
Of all of these Black women musicians, performers, and critics who were erased and have been erased, right? And that would have been a worthwhile and important contribution, right? But you're doing something more than that.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I've always talked to my students about the importance of thinking panoramically, to capture the wide scene, right? So we could tell a story that is simply about, and crucially about, hegemony, as it is reproduced through intellectual power, as it is sustained by knowledge production, right? But I wanted to also be able to capture what culture making and aesthetics have to do with power, but also unseating power. My colleague, the beautiful Roderick Ferguson, the genius scholar Rod Ferguson, who just visited my class this afternoon, our grad Gateway to African American Studies class, we were reading his We Demand, University and Student Protest. And, he relies so much on women of color critical thought, as he always does, but in this book to think about social transformation and insurgencies. And at one point he quotes Toni Cade Bambara. I'm like, I wish I had used that quote in the book. Right. Because I didn't take long enough with this long a thing, but such a beautiful quote. I wish I had it with me right now. Just thinking about what it means to pay attention to the arts as being the site where revolution can unfold, where a kind of contestation of our domination takes place. And so I really wanted to make sure that we, were able to hold on to and hold a space for the musicians as being critics in and of themselves, of their own music and of the culture. And that's not a new, innovation. That's work that you have done. That's work in jazz studies and in Black radical tradition studies that is always taught to us. But I really, really, really wanted to kind of recuperate, all of these stories of women, sisters who were innovating in their own ideas and theories, and that you can find in their archival papers, so that was very important to me.
Yeah. I'm thinking about the work of Danielle Smith, our colleague over on the journalism side, and
Yes.
she's been doing this amazing podcast the last 2 years with Ringer, Black Woman Songbook,
Yep.
And in fact, I think the work that she's done with that, along with Liner Notes to the Revolution, has really been the biggest challenge. This thing that we call the American Songbook. Right, in terms of offering a revision and a challenge to it. But part of that challenge is the archives themselves.
Yes.
What was it like trying to go deep into the archives to find sound, right? To find the material version of it, right? Because not everything's going to be up, on some streaming service, right? You got to actually find actual records and albums and things like that to do the level of archival research that you do with this project.
Yes. Oh, thank you for that question. And, shout out to Danielle Smith, who's one of my all-time heroes. Also, shout out to the Bay Area. We're both from the Bay, from Oaktown. Her book, let's just, lift it up right now, drop it in April. Shine Bright is a beacon in all sorts of ways. And I think Danielle's podcast is really, it's just so beautifully excavating just the landscape of especially 20th century R&B pop made by Black women geniuses that has not been shown the kind of critical care, that it
and the listening practices of Black women in the context of that.
That's right. Preach it. Yeah, no, Danielle, right when Danielle was just starting that book, she came to visit my class at Princeton. One of the last times that I had a visitor come to Princeton before I left and moved to Yale, but she's a longtime hero. And I'm an archive geek. I've been that way ever since my undergrad at UC Berkeley. My senior thesis was on 19th century Black women journalists and sister sentimental novelists, and the ways in which propaganda and aesthetics were something that were melded together and redeployed in the service of Black freedom struggles. And that was my first kind of introduction to spending time in the Bancroft Library at Berkeley, just trying to piece together what it means to, hold rare documents and care for them, look after them, as my dear colleague and interlocutor and collaborator, the Black queer studies theorist and Black feminist theorist, Kara Keeling, has put it. I think, I was looking for sound in a variety of different dimensions in the archive. So, what's the sheet music that Mary Lou Williams did not perform, or that she was toiling over and kind of rethinking, that you'll find in the her archives at Rutgers, or what are the blueprints for the issues or reissues of blues women's recordings that Rosetta writes. So I mentioned earlier the second wave, Upper West Side Jewish feminist who just, loved her some Black women's music and believed in it and championed it to such an extent that it just became her life for the last 30 years of her life. So starting in the late 70s, she launched her own record label, Rosetta Records, to bring back to print and to reissue the recordings of Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey and Ida Cox and sisters you've never heard of. She went back and found some of the sisters who were still around, like Dorothy Donegan and Sippy Wallace, and staged these, kind of public humanities concerts. Right. But, her whole project of putting the recordings out involved all this kind of curatorial care. And so I was really interested in her papers. They're at Duke University. I think, last time I visited there, I spent way too much time in her archive and not enough time preparing my talk, which, fond memories of that, but I don't regret it because of all the work that I was able to get done and looking over her material. But she, trying to think about her identifications with the music and what kind of a story that she wanted to tell through those recordings that had gone, had been marginalized in pop music history was a big part of what I was trying to do. I was trying to get close to both the music, but also within the archives themselves, how those thinkers and creatives cared for and preserved and looked after the music.
I remember a review that you did of a Beyonce album. It must have been her third album, that fundamentally changed the way that I thought about Beyonce.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, because and this is well before Lemonade, and even
Yeah,
the project before that. That
yeah.
there was some work of important intellectual labor that was taking place in her voice, right?
Mhm.
Not just the subject matter, right? The way that she staged particular images post Katrina and what have you,
Yes.
and that reminded me, when you talk in the book about, on one level, there's been a casual kind of glorification
Mhm.
of the genius of Black women's voices, right? The
Mhm.
innovations that come with that. But it really is just a passing thing, right? That there's
Mhm.
no real intellectual engagement and critical engagement with what folks are doing in the context of that work.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about this idea of looking seriously at Black women's vocalizing, right,
Mhm.
as being part of an intellectual project.
Mhm. That's such a great. I would never underestimate the formidable nature of your questions, Professor Neil. No, and beauty and the beauty to them. No, seriously. I mean, and you and I can talk about this kind of thing all day. But I do, one of the principal claims that I had been obsessed with early on in the writing of this book that manifests itself in different iterations throughout the book is the idea of um, Black women musicians, Black folks in general have to do this kind of work, but I'm interested especially in how Black women musicians operate as archives of historical memory. And that's certainly building on, the significantly impactful work of someone like performance studies theorist Joe Roach and his
Mhm,
theories
mhm.
of surrogation, right? And how we body forth these histories, especially when, we don't have these institutional edifices that allowed us to preserve and pass on our histories. We became the archives and the repositories of that historical memory.
Right,
And so you
right.
can absolutely think about that at the level of vocality and the ways in which citationality is about being able to weave together a tapestry of conversations that the vocalist is having with her influences across time. I've talked about, and it comes up a little bit in the book, I think in the introduction, Beyonce's her Grammy performance of Precious Lord. Take my hand, which I absolutely adore, and also the making of behind the scenes kind of making of production of that performance, which sort of anticipates the Beychella documentary in terms of the ways that you see her kind of granular interaction with her team, her creative team. But one of the narratives that she puts forth in that clip is the memory of listening to her mother, listening to Mahalia Jackson. But through the storm, and if you can kind of try to piece together how that operates with vocalists, vocalists that are able to like Abby Lincoln listening to Billie Holiday, who was listening to Bessie Smith, being
Yeah,
able to take apart and
yeah,
really piece back together that palimpsest of all of those different
yeah,
aesthetics that then manifest themselves and the work of Abby Lincoln. That's an
yeah.
extraordinary story, not only of intimate entanglements with sound and self-making practices of Black women musicians, but also again to go back to Danielle's work, right? The kind of the power of Black women's radical listening, as a way that
Mhm.
reinstantiates the constitution of their humanity.
I want to read this quote that you wrote. To aspire to the level of writing, producing knowledge akin to liner notes, is for Black women artists and Black feminist sound critics to intervene in the framing practices of others who have denied or discounted their work. I want to suggest in that quote that quote is, embodies your own work
Mm.
in dealing with, writing about these women and writing yourself into this particular tradition.
Mm. Yeah, thanks for that. I'll take that. I mean, I hope so, right? Um, I'm very mindful of what it means to try to create these inroads, these conversations about these artists who, have been elided from our kinds of dominant narratives of artistic worth and value. And so I think I'm getting at your observation just from a slightly different vantage point, but just to say that I wanted to be able to tell a story of not only that struggle on the part of the artists themselves, but to pull back the veil, so to speak, of the kind of struggles to do intellectual work as minoritized subjects,
Yeah.
to be able to create space for ourselves, and also to kind of shine the light on the dominant knowledge producers, to take them seriously as objects of inquiry. Like, how did we end up in this place, where the
Yeah,
Rock and Roll
right.
Hall of Fame exists in the way that it does? We have to really think about and take apart the desires of, the people in power, what they valued and how they reinstantiated themselves through affirming certain kinds of art. So I want to be able to do all of that, and people had different feelings about that. I'll just say.
If someone was a young graduate student that wanted to write about, or even undergraduate who wanted to write about the history of Black music, someone will obviously point them to blues people, Leroy Jones and Mary Baraka. Some really, deep in the Black nationalists, Black arts heads will say, well, you need to read A.B. Spellman, right? Yeah, for younger generation of folks, well, you must read Nelson George. Some of the names that don't come up are Eileen Southern,
Yep.
and Phil Garland.
Phil
Who
Garland.
you write about in this book.
Yeah.
Talk about who Phil Garland was and why her contribution to the archive is so significant.
Oh my God. Well, first of all, in a hopefully after times of COVID, I hope people can visit Phil Garland's archive of papers in Indiana. I hope I can do that in person. I had an incredible graduate student, Clara Wilson Hawkins, shout out to Clara, who was able to take all sorts of photographs of Phil Garland's materials and help me to think about the story that I wanted to tell about her intellectual work. She was the pop music critic for Ebony magazine, I think just labeled as music critic, and actually expansively was also thinking about Black classical music and jazz as well. But she was very particular at a certain point in her career, by the mid 70s, and saying, I grew up adoring Baraka and blues people, and I'm also recognizing the ways in which he has a hierarchy of thinking about Black music, especially with regards to jazz versus popular music culture. And I don't want to do that. I want to be able to really take seriously, not just Aretha, but the Spinners, I want to be, really, really take seriously like the wide swath of Black musicality that, means something to the masses. And that way, I think Danielle Smith is a direct heir to Phil Garland.
Right.
She wrote for a number of outlets, and she finished her career teaching at Columbia J School. And one of the things I also love about her is that she was, in her papers, we know this to be true, deeply combative with and interested in doing combative with the white music critics in her midst, especially white male critics and jazz critics. But she also was doing this kind of work that I wanted to be able to model in the book that I was just talking about, of holding up their desires as objects of inquiry and as kind of the perilous obstacles to being able to think rigorously and critically about
Mhm.
Black popular music, as it spilled out onto the radios and pop charts and into
Yeah.
Black folks' homes. She was just incredible.
Yeah, I always remember walking through the Tower Records that used to be up at Lincoln Center.
Yeah.
And I was kind of randomly going through, and someone had walked in, looking for some advice on buying a jazz album. And they had Grover Washington Jr. album in their hand. It's like, no, and the worker, the employee there's like, no, you don't want that. That's not what you want. You want John
Right.
Coltrane. And it's like,
Of course.
I could almost argue that my career begins with this idea. Well, someone has to talk about why Grover Washington Jr.
That's right.
was important to somebody.
That's right. That's right. Break it down, Mark. I mean, again, that's Danielle's book, Shine Bright, I think does that so beautifully. Yeah, and Phil was like holding it down in the early 70s, making those kinds of claims. She also was, a beautiful writer, as I admire all of my thinkers and creatives who are doing writing in this book that I'm trying to think alongside of. And I tried to extrapolate as many lessons as I could from the critics and thinkers in this book, and tried to then humbly incorporate them into my own methodologies. And so with Phil, I do think that she modeled for me a way of really drilling down on the details of Black performance aesthetics in the moment in which they're unfolding. And we can think about that in line with my colleague, the great Alexandra Vasquez's Listening in Detail. Phil was doing that as well. Her reading of Esther Phillips at Lincoln Center for the Sound of Soul out on the plaza is just it's a workshop, a master class in how to write about Black sound with a kind of just generous and imaginative granular detail. So we should all aspire to write like Phil Garland.
Mary Lou Williams, right? And of course, we got to talk about Mary Lou Williams because her center is here at Duke.
Right.
But also this idea of Mary Lou Williams is almost a self-theorist, right? And I can remember one of the lasting pieces still now from Farrah Griffin's great book on Billie Holiday was this back and forth that she was having with some musicians who kept saying that she was singing out of tune, right? And what you realize that she was singing something that they couldn't recognize and couldn't play, right?
Lady in G flat, yes.
So in that argument, she's in fact laying out a theory, right, of what she's doing as a vocalist. And you make the argument, this is something that Mary Lou Williams is very conscious of, as if she has to document her presence in a genre that she knows will be so easily erased.
Yes.
In the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's talk about Mary Lou Williams, who played across all of the 20th century changes of jazz, practically, as a boogie pianist, as really, I don't like using the maternal metaphors, but one of the progenitors of bebop and a mentor to the bebop generation, and moves into avant-garde experimental sound, that runs in a relation to her own kinds of, self-actualizations of divinity as a converted Catholic, right? And pulling all of this together then into the ways that she always imagined herself to be an experimental musician. Experimentation has everything to do with the theories that Mary Lou Williams was working through in an everyday context as a working musician, a composer, a collaborator, and a historian as well. She was very, very proud of holding up the legacies of jazz as something that should be documented as an historical phenomenon that has great purchase on the futurity of Black life. And so, I think that I tried to at least go back to my undergraduate mentor, the late, great Barbara Christian, pioneering Black feminist theorist, and her ideas about how to kind of, in one of her famous pieces, there are many, Race for Theory is often mobilized as the one, but there were many impactful works of scholarship that Professor Christian produced. But in The Race for Theory, she's really, she's trying to remind us that Black people have been theorizing since the boat touched the soil in 1619. And that if we kind of open up the ways that we understand theory as, conceptually giving us a kind of, critical apparatus to think about problem solving, and about a whole range of philosophical and social and political problems, let alone aesthetic problems, then Mary Lou Williams encapsulated all of that in her approach to musicianship. And you can find that in her papers, in the notebooks and that she kept, and letters that she wrote to Phil Garland and other interlocutors. In the Jazz Tree, this famous illustration that she collaborated on with some other creatives that gives us a kind of, history of Black music. It's really an amazing image. But at the roots of the tree, right, is suffering, right? That, that's Black radical tradition theory. Mary Lou was just doing on a doodle illustration. So
the first version of Come Sunday that I ever heard was Abby Lincoln's version of it, right?
Lordy, Lord of love, God Almighty, God above.
The second version I heard was Eric Dolphy's version.
God, when did you get to Mahalia?
Much later.
Amazing.
Much later. I mean,
Amazing.
I was 20 years old when I got into my Abby Lincoln phase.
Wow, lucky you.
And I had read about Eric Dolphy's piece based on a poem that I read in Essence magazine when they used to publish poetry, right? And I was like, I need to go track this down. Yeah. One thing that never struck me until, I'm reading your book is how much Dolphy might have taken from Abby Lincoln.
That's
right?
Nice.
Because her performance is 5 years earlier in his own performance.
Come on now.
But why don't we talk more about Abby Lincoln, right? And I mean, it's an amazing career on so many different levels, right? I was discussing with one of our colleagues earlier about how we think about Alice Coltrane in relationship to John Coltrane.
Yes.
Right. And in ways that Alice Coltrane is illegible to some folks in the absence of John Coltrane.
Yes.
And there's still, I think, some jazz purists who think about Abby Lincoln as only mattering in the context of Max Roach, right? But anyone who's sing Nothing But a Man or For the Love of Ivy or Listen to People in Me,
yes,
right,
that's
knows that there's something so much more complex there and important, right? Or her writing essays in the Black Woman collection that comes out in 1970.
Negro Digest.
Why don't we talk about Abby Lincoln more, right? And is part of the challenge of Abby Lincoln is that you actually need to come to Abby Lincoln with a certain kind of audio literacy, sonic literacy, right? To find value in what she does.
Yes. Oh, I mean, preach it, break it down, Brother Neil. I mean, so many things. Just for a moment to go back to that reference to Dolphy, I love that. And it reminds me of the conversations I've had with Farrah Griffin about what it means to understand that Miles's version of Summertime had to have been inspired by Billie Holiday's cover of Summertime, first pop music cover of Summertime in the year after the fateful debut of Porgy Bess. I have a lot of feelings about Porgy Bess. So that's just really beautiful, again, to be reminded of, these embedded forms of Black women's artistry that sit inside of the genius of, so many Black men's musical aspirations and innovations. And we have lovely scholarship that's thought about that in recent years. Abby, I think that on the one hand, in the Academy, we've been kind of slowly going through an Abbey Renaissance. So all hail, of course, Farrah Griffin's work, all hail the great Eric Porter's work and
Mhm,
what is the thing
mhm,
called jazz, right?
mhm,
I think Fred in the break, because of the ways that he, is engaging Abby in relation to Aunt Hester's Scream, there's a
mhm,
generation
mhm,
of
mhm.
Modenheads. I've never used that formulation. I don't know how you feel about that, but who were drawn to, and made curious about what Abby was doing on Triptych, to go back to her work in a variety of different ways. And there are other like jazz feminist studies projects that have taken her on. I mean, I think that she's why we haven't seen a more massive kind of embrace of Abby, even in the popular sphere, is not only because of the precarity of how jazz operates, especially along racialized and class lines still, unfortunately, in American culture, but because in some ways her entire career was a history of refusals, right? So, I mean, to appear in Marilyn Monroe's, was it, or it was Jane Mansfield's? It was Jane Mansfield's
With
dress.
the dress, right?
The
Yeah, the
red
red
dress,
dress.
Girl Can't Help It, right? Which Little Richard also appeared in. And having that whole kind of early pinup phase that she rejects in a spectacular and pronounced way in order to then embark on this, Black Power, Black radical tradition, freedom songs project in relation to bebop. We probably want to put more pressure on, what gender means in the context of
Yeah,
bebop, right? To think
right,
more about why she has not until recent years proven more central to that history. I mean, I think
right,
Scott
right.
Saul's done some good work around that in his book. But Scott DeVoe too, but you know, that kind of movement along all of these intersectional axes too for Abby made her, of course, uncategorizable in an era that, was about Black feminists trying
Right,
to lobby for,
right.
intersectional visibility. So, her interest in both championing Black manhood and being able to think about Black women's liberation from sexual violence and, recuperating the aesthetic mastery of Black women musicians, as she did in a lecture at the New
Hmm.
School. It meant that
Hmm.
she really kind of, her capaciousness and her robust intellect and curiosities and passions, aesthetically, I think are, manifest the ethos of Black studies.
Yeah.
And in that sense, there wasn't room for her because it was, too much and not enough. But I do feel like there's something happening with our students right now. They've been very interested in her, and that excites me.
Yeah. And I think there's a way she also, particularly in her later life, mentored a lot of younger musicians.
Absolutely.
The first time I heard Steve Coleman
Mm.
was
Yes,
on her
of course.
Talk to the Sun
Of
album,
course.
right?
Yep,
And
yep, yep,
James Weideman and that whole M-Bass
yep,
crew that
yeah,
emerges at that point in time.
yeah.
One last thing I want to talk about, Slow Fade to Black. Obviously a series by Carrie Mae Weems,
Mhm.
but also a concert, with the
Yeah.
late Jerry Allen. Talk a little bit about that concert performance.
Mm. I wish I could have been there. I mean, this was really like one of those, I know why I wasn't there. I could not catch the train from Princeton and make it into Brooklyn in time for that actual show. So thank goodness for archival footage and
Right.
for Carrie Mae Weems' team, who was so generous towards me when I was doing research on the book. But what I love about that event at Prospect Park is that it showed the ways in which Black feminist creatives, who in my book are, interested in centralizing the significance and the importance of Black musicality and Black women's musicalities that permeates all aspects of our lives. It modeled a way to show how that story can extend beyond one particular form in the telling of it. So originally Carrie Mae Weems, who's, one of our genius artists who, or one of her principal forms is photography, though it is not the only one,
Right.
had mounted this deeply influential and galvanizing show, Slow Fade to Black, in which she was collecting all of these different archival images of genius Black women musicians, but presenting them out of focus. And if that's not a statement, right, about historical memory and obfuscations and within our, social imagination, I don't know what is. But she's kind of reproduced that work in all of these different iterations, be it in blowing up those images and putting them on the streets of, Canadian cities, or in this case, being able to put together this concert, this collaboration with Jerry Allen that took the images, blew them up on the back screen, but then brought into the round a whole range of different performers, from jazz genius Liz Wright to one of the a cappella choirs at Howard, to kind of to activate the conviviality of Black women's musicianship, such that we can be reminded of how that musicianship, that genius, that artistic beauty exceeds the peril of precarity that's caught up in that image, right? So it's like being able to produce these performances that sustain a conversation with the music, and also the problem of how the music has lived on and has also fallen in and out of view historically. And so it was kind of like a public conversation and meditation on both the power and influence and radical feeling of Black women's musicality, and what we need to do to look after it, to again cite Professor Keeling, to be in the round with it. And I will just say that, I really, really, really dream of a time when we can have, when we can be together again, obviously, but also have these kinds of grassroots moments where we can come together, not just to watch live music and to engage with it, which is so important, but to think about the different ways that we have conversations with it. And it's something that I've tried to do in my work at Yale with the Black Sound in the Archive Working Group, which I hope in after times, Professor Neal, we can get you up here for. And in other projects that I've worked on, like with Jack White and the Blues Women's recordings that I write about in the book, we've tried to hold these spaces where people come together and listen to the records and talk about them. And so that Carrie Mae Weems's work with the late, great Jerry Allen was very much an inspiration for that kind of work that I do.
Yeah, thank you. We've been joined today by Professor Daphne A. Brooks, the William R. Keenan Jr. Professor of African American Studies, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Music at Yale. She's the author of the classic Bodies in Dissent, Spectacular Performances of Race and Freedom, 1850 to 1910. That would be Duke University Press, 2006. And of course, what will be the award-winning Liner Notes for the Revolution, The Intellectual Life of Black Feminist Sound, published by Harvard University in 2021. As always, it is a joy to talk with you, Daphne.
Thank you, man. Professor Neal, it's an honor. It's you're my dream interlocutor, so I appreciate you so much.
Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black, culture over everything.